Senator Young. Ambassador Sullivan, good to see you again. Dr. Taylor, good to see you. And thank you both for your years of service to our country and your thoughtfulness. Let me begin with the issue of burden sharing, because you just mentioned it, Ambassador. I think we would all agree that there's now more enthusiasm than there was just a couple of years ago among our European partners for the NATO alliance and investment in that alliance in various ways. I believe it's crucial that the U.S. continue to use levers at its disposal to ensure that Europeans are as invested in their own security as the U.S. is in maintaining stability in Europe. So, Ambassador Sullivan, what mechanisms are available to us to ensure that all European members of NATO quickly meet and sustain defense spending at no less than 2% and 20% thresholds agreed to in Wales nearly 10 years ago?
Well, thank you, Senator. Good to see you again. Well, that's been a vital question for years, going back to when I was Deputy Secretary, and then President Trump was railing about the fact that European allies, big countries, weren't meeting the Wales commitment that had been made based on what had happened in Ukraine, recall. So since then, I think the shift since February 24th of 2022, I think we've seen countries like Germany have a pretty dramatic shift. It's going to take a while for their systems to turn. Imagine our own system, right? Increasing defense spend. I mean, these are important, difficult questions. So we've got to keep the pressure on, make the case for why it's important and the threat that they face from the East.
So that all makes sense with me, and this is in part about sustaining domestic support for resourcing the Ukrainians, right? And so that's really what is most on my mind. Is there a way in your mind that we can do a better job of elevating those who are meeting their commitments and ensuring that people understand that they are shining examples of what other countries should aspire to?
Well,
the carrot as opposed to the stick.
Yeah, the carrot. We can't diminish, of course, the guarantees of the treaty. So we can't say, well, we might be slower coming to your rescue if you get invaded by Russia.
Right.
But so without undermining that, I think for those countries that need to be persuaded of the need to meet the Wales commitment, given what's happened in the 15 months since February 2022, that's a fair approach.
Could I add one quick point?
Oh, please,
I agree about the 2% is a critically important benchmark, and I do hope at the Vilnius summit that there will be a shift as the 2% is the floor and not the ceiling. But just as important as the how much is the how allies are spending, and I think that's another area where the United States can continue to put pressure on allies and partners to make sure that the spending is done appropriately and most effectively. And certainly as we're thinking of like a potential two-front war as conflict tensions heat up with China, I think many of us are concerned about what that would mean. You know, what would the United States need to take out of Europe if we did have a confrontation with China? Yeah. And so ensuring that our European allies and partners understand what it is that we would take out, the logistics, the air-to-air refueling, the ISR, those capabilities, that's where allies really need to be investing so that we're prepared for that kind of scenario. So it's the how much, but it's also the how.
Okay, I may follow up on that thoughtful point to try and get a better sense of what NATO is actually doing, what contingencies, which might be publicly available, can you or others speak to, so that I have a measure of confidence that conversation is happening. If I could, with some remaining time here, just briefly touch on New START. Senator Van Hollen and I have been pretty outspoken about the value of arms control between the U.S. and Russia over the years, both for its own sake, but also for the message it sends to other nuclear powers. In February, as we know, we saw Vladimir Putin announce a suspension of Russia's participation in New START, the last arms control treaty between the U.S. and Russia. Despite Russia's non-compliance, the administration has continued to indicate that it will continue to uphold its end of the treaty. And so, Ambassador Sullivan, if you could just briefly indicate how you assess the effects of Russia's suspension of the treaty, especially in the risk of misunderstanding leading to a nuclear exchange.
Well, thank you, Senator. My understanding is that what Putin announced, the Russian government had actually already previously announced. The foreign ministry had said no more meetings of the Bilateral Consultative Commission, no inspections. Putin announces the suspension of Russia under the New START Treaty. I understand, though, that the foreign ministry clarified shortly thereafter and said that Russia would continue to comply with the numerical limits in the treaty. It's just that they've eliminated, by eliminating the inspections, they've eliminated one of the means for us to verify that they're complying with the treaty. So it's problematic. We are not allowing the Russians to do inspections here if they're not allowing us to do them there. We have also said we will comply with the numerical limits under the treaty.
Is that the best we can do at this point, or do you have additional thoughts, either of you, about how we should evaluate our own nuclear posture and missile defense posture in Europe?
The only point I would add is a point that I made earlier, which is the more degraded that Russia's conventional forces become, the more they will rely on their nuclear weapons, including their non-strategic nuclear weapons. The more vulnerable they feel, the more quickly they will go to the nuclear. And so it really shortens the pathway to nuclear war. So I do think that we are entering kind of in a new where the threat of nuclear use is only rising. And so not only do we need to continue to think about what role arms control can play in this, but I do think we have to think very hard about our deterrent posture. So at NATO, do we need to bring back more of our nuclear exercises? How do we convince the Russians that we will fight through a nuclear war, for example? So I think that, so in addition to the arms control piece, which I do continue to believe is critically important, I do think that we have to be aware that we are headed towards a future without arms control, and we, along with allies and partners, are going to have to think about how we get better at deterrence.
Thank you both. Your presence here is so valuable.
Senator Van Hollen.